thanks so much for tuning in to our first program of our season. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Block, now in our 26th year, and I'm so honored to start this season with Phil Rucker, Carol Leonnig, and Jacob Soboroff. I thank them for returning to Writer's Block. All three of them were here in person for A Very Stable Genius. Jacob also joined us for his book, Separated. Those two books helped to define an era of constant chaos and daily horror in American politics. The new Leonnig Rucker book, Only I Can Fix It, gives us details from Trump's inner circle on Trump's final year in office. Over the years, as award-winning journalist for the Washington Post, it seems that anyone is willing to open up to them. The people that do were in the room as the president made countless self-serving, impulsive, and dangerous pronouncements. As I raced through this book, which is so fantastic, I couldn't help but feel as if I were right there. I couldn't put it down. From one upending crisis to another, Trump fueled unrest and insurrection, fantasizing about martial law, and some of his staff confided in Carol and Phil that Trump was invoking the gospel of the Führer. This book is bracing in so many ways, from pandemic sabotage to the refusal to accept Biden's victory. Phil and Carol expose the relentless and self-dealing page after page. I urge everyone to read the material on the Capitol insurrection. The interview that Trump agreed to do with Phil and Carol from his exile in Mar-a-Lago is entertaining in the extreme and unsettling. When you read Only I Can Fix It, keep in mind that the other day, it was reported that Trump has raised over $100 million in campaign contributions. Jacob Soboroff is an NBC journalist who brought home the truths of our border policy, separating children from their parents and holding them in cages in horrifying conditions. His book, Separated, details personal stories of these families, as well as reportage on the Trump administration's unyielding cruelty along our southern border. The book hit every Best Books of the Year list and won enormous critical recognition. Carol and Phil have signed book plates at Chevalier's books for Only I Can Fix It. I urge you to visit our website to get a link to Chevalier's for these most terrific and important books. You will have questions. Email them to us at reservations@writersblockpresents.com and we'll try to get to them. In the meantime, I present with such gratitude Carol Leonnig, Phil Rucker, and Jacob Soboroff.
Andrea, thank you so much for that very kind, very generous introduction. It's good to be back with you, especially with my friends Phil and Carol. And I'm sure of the 600 plus people who are here right now, many of you were with us in that auditorium at New Road School in Santa Monica for the conversation that Carol, Phil, and I had for Very Stable Genius. There's one person who I hope made it in. That's my mother, who texted me saying that there was a wait list and she could no longer get in before this started. I haven't heard from her, but Mom, text me and let me know that you've got it okay. If not, I'll just conference call you and let you in. But I really do want to get right into it with Carol and Phil, because as everybody has said, and I'm sure that all of you have read the news about this book, have read some of the juiciest moments or heard about them, heard the audio of President Trump, probably on your television or on your radio. But I wanted to ask the two of you, first about your interview with President Trump. You guys say, if I recall correctly, that you talked to 140 sources or had 140 interviews for this book, which paints an extraordinarily 500 plus page picture of 2020, of the final year of the president. But I'm wondering, I know it was 2.5 hours, it was supposed to be an hour. You know, many of us know the things he said, although I hope he will remind us of some of them. But I wonder, and Carol, maybe you can go first, about how important that interview itself was for you two as reporters to painting the picture you were able to paint in those, 400 and change pages before we get to your sit down with the president, the former president of the United States.
You know, it seems so brilliant on our part going down to interview him and being able to talk to him for that long. But honestly, it was almost an accident in some respects that we obtained such amazing reflection from the president. Reflection is an interesting word for it. We didn't go in thinking, oh my gosh, we have to interview President Trump to write this book. We'd already interviewed 140 people. Phil and I had sat down, often happily together, to interview people, sometimes for 5 and 7 hours at a sitting, people that had been at the right hand of the president throughout 2020, this chaotic, catastrophic year. We didn't feel like we needed to know a lot more about these facts because they'd been corroborated so thoroughly. And so, in a sense, it was like an exercise of like, okay, well, let's hear what he has to say. But when we left that club of the presidents, that beautiful mansion, and the Moroccan tiled patio that Marjorie Merriweather Post put together with our architect, when we left, both of us were just sort of pinching ourselves at what we had heard the president say. It was completely alternate reality. He had calcified this inner narrative in which, black was white and peace was, war and hate was love. Um, January 6th was a peaceful place with loving, hugging individuals who came to support him and were ushered in warmly by the Capitol Police. Phil and I know, and and everyone listening knows that is not true. In his version of reality, as he sat down with us, he had been outstripped of his rightful second term. There were a million examples he provided us, I'm exaggerating, but many detailed examples of how the election had been stolen from him in state by state with all these specifics,
In a physical binder, if I'm not mistaken, right, Carol?
Yeah, and a flooded precinct room where miraculous valises of faked votes and ballots for Biden were inserted into the machines when no one could see, and a truck full of votes for Biden that came out of nowhere, and a truck driver who admitted that he was part of the plot. The problem was, of course, as you know, the Attorney General told the president, as we report in our book, that none of this was true. So I have to say that the interview was an amazing event to me and to Phil, and also an absolute shock and surprise. It ended up explaining a lot about why 2020 was such a nightmare.
What did that, and by the way, I should remind everybody that Carol, Phil, and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes, but then you all will have the opportunity to submit questions. Andrea mentioned that at the top, but if you haven't yet, please feel free to do that. Phil, is that the same for you? I mean, it sounds like this was so deeply reported, and then you go down to Mar-a-Lago, which he pointed out to you meant ocean to lake, or lake to ocean, or ocean to lake. And does he corroborate? Is that the right word? Sort of the accounts of these 140 sources that you talked to? I mean, what exactly what'd you expect versus what happened at that 2.5-hour meeting?
Well, we wanted to challenge him on some of what we had reported from the last year, but more than that, we just wanted to hear his side of the story and understand his perspective from that year. And we weren't going in there looking to determine the truth from him, because we know he's not a truthful narrator. And we'd already spoken, as Carol mentioned, to all these other sources who brought us behind the scenes, and we corroborated details and anecdotes and moments with those sources to determine what the truth was. So we knew what this book was going to say, and we knew what really happened in that final year before we got to Palm Beach. But nonetheless, we're journalists, and it's really important, I think, anytime you're writing about a subject, whether, he's a celebrity or the president, a political figure, that you talk to that person if you can, and get their perspective and incorporate it into our narrative. And we were blown away by how dystopian the whole scene was, and how kind of warped Trump's version of reality was, but it did not impact our book. I think Trump hoped it would impact our book. I think he thought he could put on the charm and talk to us a little longer than normal, and welcome us to have dinner, and and wait on us, and suddenly we would be persuaded to see the world as he does, and write in our book that actually Trump won the state of Arizona, and there was all this election fraud that the liberal enemy haters were concocting to deny him his rightful second term. But we're not that gullible, and we certainly didn't draw those conclusions, and you can tell just by the cover of our book.
Well, it makes me laugh, Phil, because just hearing you say that makes me recall sort of the very end of the epilogue, where you guys have done this interview and then you go in to have dinner, and the former president comes back to check on you, and you write, later in the evening, Trump returned to check on us. He wanted to make sure we were comfortable. His gallantry seemed genuine. Good conversation, Trump said. I'm getting the word out. The interview, he said, was a, quote, great honor. He offered to do another if we needed to ask anything else, and shrugged off mention of how many hours he had already spent answering our questions. I enjoyed it, actually, Trump said, twinkle in his eye. For some sick reason, I enjoyed it. And do I hear you saying you thought that he might have been able to affect ultimately what went into this book, despite all the reporting you did?
I really love, Jacob, that you singled in on that moment, because it was quite a chuckle to have him be so seemingly self-aware, right? I have a sickness. I love the attention. I need you. I want an audience. That's what I think he was essentially admitting in that moment. I don't think he believed he was going to really change our narrative. He knows what we wrote in A Very Stable Genius, but he was trying to get the word out, right? I mean, and weirdly, it kind of boomeranged on him. Here he was trying to communicate through us how it really is, but when you hear his own words on our audio recording and in the epilogue, people recoil in horror. That is how he sees it. I mean, to be sure, many of his supporters have told Phil and told me that in the course of our rollout of this book, that they'll never believe anything we say. The problem is, the president is the person who said it. The problem is the president fact-checked our book. So you can't really dispute what's in it.
It's terrifying, actually, and there's so many specific things I want to get to. But as a reporter, I just have so many questions specifically about how this all came to pass. And you also mentioned that he had something to say or read A Very Stable Genius and knew sort of your body of reporting very clearly. I know, I don't mean to rub it in, and I think you guys are going to kick out of it too, but some of the things that he tweeted, this is when your first book came out, 2 stone cold losers from the Amazon Washington Post. Almost every story is made up lie, just like corrupt Paul Shifty Schiff, who fraudulently made up my call with Ukraine fiction, exclamation point. So, and you address this in the introduction of the book, but honestly, if you said, maybe it's some kind of sickness, jokingly, but what was in it for him to sit down with you, knowing that you're not going to, you're a fair journalist, you're going to present what he had to say, but this is not, I assume that he didn't know the subtitle of the book, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year. Is that safe to assume, Phil, before you sat down?
That's safe. Jacob, we did not discuss our proposed title with him in the interview, although we did tell him that he was very likely to have his photo on the cover of the book, and he was excited about that. So that was a big win for Trump to have his photo.
Did the first book come up at all in the conversation when you guys sat down?
Strangely, it did not. No.
And I would just add one thing, forgive me, I know Phil would want to say too, which is that not only did the former president get to hear that his face was going to be on the cover, but when Phil told him that, Donald Trump's reaction was, "Oh, if my face is on it, you're going to sell a lot of copies."
He was right. He was right about that. One of the things, well, a couple things, but one that I wanted to ask about was January the 12th. And January the 12th was the day before the president's second impeachment. And it kind of ties into the way that he thinks about all this, why he sat down with you, and why he would do the interview. Obviously, so much of this book leads up to and details the events of January 6th, and ultimately what will be the legacy of that day, the insurrection. But on January 12th, that day, he went down to the border, and this just stuck out to me, having covered the border, with Lindsey Graham, and did what they thought would be to deflect attention from January 6th, a sort of a victory tour. And you write about, and I was so fascinated to read this, on Air Force One, he asks, there's a kid, I told you we were gonna have kids in the background. On Air Force One, he asks Lindsey Graham sort of what his impression of January 6th was. And again, if I remember correctly, Lindsey Graham said something to the effect of, it's something that we're going to read about in the history books forever. And it'll always be associated with your presidency. Can you talk a little bit about when you sat with him, how he sees that day? It was interesting to me that he's asking around about how others will see it. Did sort of what Lindsey Graham said, or anybody else for that matter, seep into his consciousness about that day, as far as you're concerned?
You know, it was pretty clear to Trump that he understood that January 6th was a part of his legacy and was a day that would be remembered in history. But what he's trying to do is change the way history remembers it, right? So he seemed determined to try to reiterate to Carol, either to convince us, but more likely to just get the word out in the book, that there were actually police officers letting the rioters in, that there were hugs, there were kisses, it was a loving crowd, that what Trump wanted from that day was what his supporters wanted, which was to overturn the election result. But his supporters also wanted to hang Vice President Mike Pence and wanted to, violently breach the US Capitol. So, he's trying to whitewash history in that sense. And it's interesting that you keyed in on the trip down to the border. And I was on that trip myself. It was my last time on Air Force One as a White House reporter. And Trump's effort, the whole point of the trip was to try to promote the border wall as a legacy item. He was on like a victory tour, hoping that he could shift media attention away from January 6th to focus on some of his accomplishments in office. But the whole trip was doomed, because when he left, he answered questions about January 6th to reporters, and he said something along the lines of, he has no regrets about anything that happened, and that became a banner headline that overtook the whole day. But setting that aside, he was grappling with the historical significance of that day in those final 2 weeks in office, and it wasn't just Senator Graham. Jared Kushner, Mark Meadows, others around him were really trying to get him into a better headspace so that he could grapple with that piece of his legacy while also promoting other elements of his legacy. But he was just so fuming over the media coverage in the aftermath of January 6th that they couldn't convince him to do this sort of victory tour apart from that trip down to the border. And it was a really kind of dire way for the administration to end. And even some of his supporters in the White House told Carol and me in reporting for this book that they were so disappointed in how those final 14 days went, that they thought Trump missed a big opportunity to try to recast the narrative of his presidency.
You mentioned, Phil, the Vice President, Mike Pence, the former Vice President Mike Pence. And one of the things that I was really shocked to read, and forgive me if I missed you guys talking about this previously, was that while Pence was a robot. Oh no! So one of your sources said, to basically describe Pence as a robot. He always did everything that Trump wanted to do, and he kind of, by some, has been looked at as I don't want to characterize it, but that he did the right thing, some might say, on January 6th by moving forward with certifying the results of the Electoral College. But this stuck out to me. The quote was, Pence actually wanted to fulfill Trump's wishes, not to certify the election. Carol, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because, it's the letter from Pence. So help me God, I'm going to do the right thing. But are you saying, or is this source saying, that he didn't want to do that?
So he would have, if the law would have allowed him. This is based on our reporting with multiple people that were close to him. He wanted, if the law allowed him, to do what the president wanted. He was bound and determined to do the proper research, to do the due diligence, had his staff of lawyers and others outside the White House review this to try to see, was there a way, right? He wants to help the president out, but the law is pretty clear. And John Eastman, while a law professor who's advising the president that there's some strange, precedent that doesn't exist back in Jefferson's day about rejecting some of the ballots and taking them for himself. Despite that kind of convoluted logic that doesn't really apply, Pence realizes I have to certify the election. That's my role here. It's not ceremonial. It's constitutional. It's important, and that's what he tells the president the night before January 6th, and that's what he reiterates to him on January 6th in the morning.
I guess what struck me though is, and maybe it's just the way that I read it, is that if there was even the narrowest of pathways for him to not certify or throw out some of the results, he would have done so. Is that the correct reading?
I think that's a bridge. That's a little too far. I think
Okay.
it means he wanted to countenance the possibility that he could do what the president wanted. But as you know from reading the book, he couldn't have been more stubborn
Right.
once he was under threat, under house arrest, once there were nooses outside the windows of his hideaway. He couldn't have been more determined to fulfill that constitutional duty.
Including deciding not to allow the Secret Service to extract him from the Capitol building. I'm curious how the two of you understood that, because in the book, that's immediately followed by, the president, I think, spoke to him, or Meadows spoke to, I can't remember exactly at the moment, but he didn't really ask, how are you doing? It was a very brief and curt conversation. Did he not want to leave? Why did he not want to leave?
First of all, the president didn't speak to Pence. That they spoke that morning before Trump.
But not afterwards. It was Meadows, right?
Meadows spoke with Mark Short, who was the vice president of staff at a staff level, to like a very curt, brief check-in. But Pence, according to our reporting, did not want to leave the Capitol because he wanted to stay and get the job done. He felt like if the Secret Service evacuated him from the grounds, he would not be able to finish his duty, his constitutional duty to certify the election. And the Secret Service actually tried to get him to go into his armored limousine in the basement of the Capitol because they thought that would be the safest place for him to be. And he said, no, I'm not getting in the vehicle, because if I get in the vehicle, some agent is going to drive me away from here, and I'm going to stay here and finish the job at the Capitol. And indeed, he and his family, his wife, his daughter, Charlotte, his brother, Greg, who's a congressman from Indiana, they stayed in the basement.
Man, that is so fascinating. Carol, I wonder how you interpreted all of that based on you wrote a whole book about the Secret Service, Zero Fail, which is on my shelf directly behind the camera. Everybody should get that book too. How did you interpret that? Because in the press, there was some conversation of maybe there were some elements of, or in the chatter in class, so to speak, maybe the Secret Service wanted to get him out of there as part of some grander plan or plot. Is there any credence to that?
In some respects, no, and in some respects, yes, because there are two things going on. And Pence articulates this actually that day. He turns to his detail leader, Tim Goebbels, and says, I trust you, Tim, not to drive me out of here. But I don't know that the other agents won't take me out.
Wow.
And Pence is right, because what we also learn later on in our reporting, and is now in the book, is that Keith Kellogg, Pence's national security advisor, is talking to Tony Ornato, who is definitely a Trump guy.
Right.
He was the head of Trump's detail, and Trump loved him so much, he made him a White House deputy chief of staff. Keith Kellogg is talking to Tony Ornato and says, I know you guys, I know something's up. And Tony Ornato says, our plan is to evacuate him to Joint Base Andrews. So Pence, without even knowing that's what they're thinking about doing, realizes something's afoot. Ornato wants to take him to Joint Base Andrews, possibly for good security reasons, possibly to get him the heck out of the Capitol. Makes sense. There are people calling for his head. But Ornato is definitely a Trump guy. And if you remove the person who certifies the election from the building, then you don't know what kind of rupture will happen in terms of if that chapter ever reopens. When does certification happen again exactly? Is that chain broken forever? So Kellogg tells Ornato, you're going to take him to Joint Base Andrews. I know you guys. And then you'll fly him to Alaska. So
right.
It's clear to me that Pence took an incredibly stubborn stand. A detail leader worth his salt wants to get his guy out of there. It was totally unsafe. But Pence has the power to throw down and say no. And that's actually pretty shocking that he was able to accomplish that with his own sort of force of will. As for a conspiracy, um, I don't know if anybody was really plotting one, but removing Ornato's plan to remove him to Joint Base Andrews would have stopped, the progress of democracy that day.
Right, by operational definition, he needed to be there in order to see this through. Um, when we talk about the president and the election and trying to overturn the results of the election, and I think people, me specifically, I guess personally, I think about his conversations throughout the actual election period as talk about the election's going to be rigged, the whole thing about mail-in balloting, which you detail, quite extensively, and how that backfired. But one of the things I was shocked to read is as early as August 27th, which was the day he accepted the nomination, the RNC nomination at the White House, you guys end that chapter. Is a really interesting chapter that everybody should read, because Dr. Fauci also got a powdery white substance said to him, which he opened on that day. It's an amazing scene to read. But you end that chapter by saying, this was Trump's Washington. This is after his acceptance speech, defiant at the White House, breaking norms by doing it on at the White House, where political events normally don't happen. This was Trump's Washington. The power was his. He didn't plan to relinquish it. It would have to be taken from him. What is that based on at that time? I mean, because to me, that was like, wow, that's early for such a strong statement. Is that a foreshadow of what was to come? Or was there some element of this as early as the Republican convention, thoughts of how to hang on to power, whatever it took?
Jacob, we wrote that into the chapter in part as to foreshadow what was to come after the election, of course. But there were signs early on that he was, if not try to hold on to power through a coup, was at least going to pull out all the stops and perhaps not be a fair player in the run-up to the election. Remember, he for months had been discounting the credibility and the legitimacy of mail-in balloting,
yeah,
and waging a war against mail-in ballots and trying to sow doubt in the minds of his supporters, his millions of supporters, about whether election results that relied on mail-in ballots could be believed to be accurate and true and legitimate. And he was also, by the way, trying to flex his muscle, his executive power, his authority as the commander-in-chief with his military leaders when it came to sending in the military to deal with the domestic and civil unrest in the wake of the George Floyd killing that happened all throughout the summer in Portland and Seattle and other cities. And there was just this constant sort of push and pull between him and the leaders at the Pentagon that I think was also concerning, or at least a sign of him trying to exercise that power. So yes, foreshadowing, but there were some beginning hints of the trouble to come.
Since you brought it up, I mean, I think most people who have been following this in the news know the role that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, plays in this story, both around the time of the civil unrest in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, but also, you detail, and it's actually truly unbelievable, sort of a plan, an informal plan that they came up with, he in particular, to make sure that the military wasn't used in the election, and what to do if the president basically wouldn't leave. I just wonder your reaction to learning more about the way that he operated inside this White House.
It was really quite a jaw-dropping experience to learn the details of just how frightened and proactive and protective the general, who had seen combat more than a dozen times, was in preparing to throw his body in front of some devilment by Donald Trump or his allies. Because he believed that there was a coup afoot, I mean, he was getting middle of the night phone calls from people he trusted who warned him to have his back, warned him about Trump loyalists that were being installed in the dead of night in the Pentagon. And the number one thing on Chairman Milley's mind was, what if they get their hands on the guys with the guns? He could, obviously, let me give you a couple reasons why he was worried. He knew Donald Trump was willing to cross pretty much any brook, cross any line, break and stretch any law after June 1. So he was on guard for what Donald Trump might do to deploy the military.
And June 1, Carol, was, just sorry to interrupt you, but June 1 was that photo op where they went across the street to Lafayette Park, right?
That's right. That's where he feels played and used, and goes to bed that night furious that he's been dragged across this park for a photo op, a park where peaceful protesters used to be until they were hit with rubber bullets and riot gear, all so the president could cross the square. So he's on guard. And he knows that the president is constantly in the summer trying to invoke some version of the Insurrection Act in order to, again, unleash active duty military on protesters just so he can look tough. He's wanting to do that over and over again. Then he starts getting these middle of the night calls about loyalists in the Defense Department and other places, plots to topple the CIA director, plots to bring back Kash Patel and possibly install him as the FBI director. And then the next thing that Chairman Milley learns is, wow, wait a minute. Some of Trump's allies, close allies, are invoking language that's really frightening about citizens taking to the streets and changing the results of the election. Michael Flynn at a December protest begins talking about how the courts won't decide this. It'll be the people who take to the streets and decide that President Trump stays in office. And in fact, he says from a podium, Donald Trump is going to remain our president. So he hears this rhetoric, right? He begins worrying, girding for the worst, and meeting with his other Joint Chiefs of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And what do they talk about? How do we stop Donald Trump from using us, playing us, putting his hands on the guys with the guns to stay in power? And they plot through what can they do. And one of the things they legally can do is serially resign one by one, slowly, a kind of reverse Saturday Night Massacre. And again, the idea is we'll throw our own bodies in front of an order to deploy the military that we think is dangerous for the country, dangerous for the democracy.
He is one of several people in the book, General Milley, who apologize after the fact about something that they participated in as a member of the Trump administration, whether in a civilian role or otherwise. The other one that comes to mind is Han from was FDA, is that right?
Okay.
And that was over, sort of a statement, I don't know, inflated statement about the esficacy of convalescent plasma or something like that.
Right.
And there might have been another one. I guess
Mark Esper.
That's right, Mark Esper as well. What is it? Why does that happen? Or what is your read on why that happens within the Trump administration? That people who ostensibly have some kind of backbone to stand up to this administration only are doing it after the fact in those types of, some might say a CYA, cover your tush, type of moments, rather than being able to do it in the moment. Is it part of the way that the White House operates, or what was it that put these people in a position to do this after the fact, but not stop as it was happening?
Yeah, well, it's definitely, these are CYA moments, and these people are thinking about their own kind of personal legacies, their own employment potential when they leave the government, but they're grappling with in real time calculations and a really slippery slope about, when do you stand up to Trump and say no, or when do you go along with it and hope to keep your job? And they all wanted to keep their jobs and stay in power, either for personal reasons because they liked being in the cabinet or what have you, or because they thought it was essential for the preservation of America's democracy for them to stay in the job, which is, I think, how someone like General Milley viewed it. And, in real time, they feel like, and we know this from talking to people who are familiar with their thoughts after the fact and reporting this book, they felt like they didn't quite know where the boundaries were. And there were some hard lines that they were not willing to cross, but it starts to get really blurry as you inch up closer and closer to those lines. And so you look at the Hahn example, you know, he made an inflated statement at a press conference that the president wanted done right on the eve of the Republican National Convention beginning about the FDA's approval of convalescent plasma treatments for COVID. And he inflated the efficacy of it and immediately regretted it afterwards. But in the moment, he thought what he was saying was okay, and it was
good
what
enough.
The president demanded, and it was good enough, and there was like a scientific kind of sort of defense of it, and he felt like it wasn't as damaging as it ended up being after it came out of his mouth. And you know, in the case of Millie and Esper, they were a part of the Lafayette Square photo op that Carol was talking about. But when they were actually walking across the park, they didn't fully understand what they were doing or what was going to be happening. They were just being told to come along, the president wants you to come, and they just walked. And they were, you know, ignorant and naive in that particular moment, which, you know, they regret to this day. But they're just, it also is really hard for these people to stand up to Trump because he's such a domineering force, both his power, he's the president, but also his physicality. The way he holds himself in these meetings, he is intimidating to some of them. And you could have some really tough members of his cabinet who will want to tell you after the fact that they you know, spoke the truth to the president and stood up to him, but in front of him they're like wilting flowers in a way. I mean, it can be hard for these people to really have the steel in their spines to confront him.
One of the people actually who didn't do a public apology, but I found really fascinating to read about him because of his role actually in the family separation crisis, which, you know, you guys want to cover closely, is Alex Azar, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which of course was deeply involved in the response to the coronavirus, but also ran the shelters that cared for the migrant children. He didn't clash often publicly with the president, but you have some very interesting scenes about how they had private friction at times. And ultimately, despite thinking he was going to be fired, as one of the people that I think one of the few that survived all 4 years of this term of the Trump-Pence administration. What did you learn about him and his relationship with the president? Because I thought at times actually you paint a very adversarial picture, including I think he was one of many people in the book that told Trump that he was going to lose the election very candidly if he didn't do this, that, or the other thing. And that seemed to be rather effective in getting President Trump to do what they wanted.
Alex Azar, to me, after all the reporting that Phil and I did, hours and hours of interviewing all sorts of people who had some, you know, front row seats for those experiences, or were briefed on them in detail later. What I feel we took away from that was that Alex Azar probably got kicked in the shorts more than anybody else in the cabinet.
Yeah.
It felt like the president was always reaming him out, always yelling at him at the top of his lungs. There became this catchphrase in the Trump administration of, you know, the president's going to rip your face off. I feel like his face got ripped off a lot. And in fact, I'm thinking of two moments when Azar confided to people later that they were the lowest points in his professional career were when the president was screaming at him at the top of his lungs. And one of them that that I'd like to relay involved a moment when it was so clear the president had no idea how government worked. I know we all say that lightly, but it was a shock to Azar as he heard the president called him on the phone when Azar's in a car being driven over to the Oval Office. They're supposed to be talking at the coronavirus task force, and the president calls him without even waiting to say hello or to say his name, and just says, "Who the hell arranged testing? Who the hell is responsible for this testing?" And he's yelling at the top of his lungs. And Azar's like, "What do you mean, Mr. President? Slow down, slow down. What do you mean?" And they finally get to the nub of it. And it's that Trump believes testing is killing me, he says. Testing's killing me. And it's not that people are getting tested. It's not even that the one thing that I know reporters were really concerned about as they wrote about it, that there weren't enough tests available to the general public so that people could figure out who was infected and who wasn't, and therefore kind of wall off the virus to some extent and reduce transmission. It wasn't that. He was furious that the CDC was conducting testing, which he believed was jacking up the numbers of people who were found to be sick. And Azar took a long time in this conversation to try to figure out what is the president mad about. And at one point, the president says, who monitors the CDC? Who's responsible for the CDC? And Azar says, you're kidding, right, sir? And explains that it's me. I'm the Secretary of Health and Human Services. It's me. And Trump says, well, then fine. Now I have my answer. So legitimately, genuinely, it appears that in the middle of a pandemic at which the president has had no fewer than 6 briefings about how they're going to respond to this, he doesn't know who runs the CDC, who oversees it. And this was, one of the many low points.
I find there's another interesting moment between Azar. This happens actually with Trump in the book and another person as well, but with Azar and Trump about masking. And I think it was around the Amy Coney Barrett, I guess it was the nomination or the press conference at the White House where it was the super spreader event. And they're talking about actually wearing a mask. And it sounds like in the book, Trump was told multiple times about how masks work by Azar, by other people. Sir, this is why I want to wear a mask. This is why and then they agree. Okay, take him down at the podium. I think somebody even says it might have been Azar. It's 70% effective within this amount of feet. If you're wearing the mask and you take it off, it's going to spread. That type of stuff that Trump is hearing over and over from his aides is obviously not getting into his head. What do they say, particularly the science around coronavirus? What did they say to you about the scientific advice that was given directly to him? That one just struck me because it was like they said the same thing to him multiple times. And I guess my question is, did he not hear it? Does he not listen to it? Or does he not care? And he's pretending like, he never heard it.
He didn't care about the scientific evidence regarding masking. And it's interesting, his advisors made another argument to him about why he should support masks, and that had to do with polling numbers, which he is much more responsive to than any sort of scientific study. And his pollster, Tony Fabrizio, along with Jared Kushner and a few other of his political advisors, met with him in the summer in the Oval Office and tried to convince him to support federal, not exactly a federal mask mandate, but federal mask recommendations, and for him to personally be wearing the mask and advocating for other people to wear the mask, because they showed him that a majority of the voters, a large majority of the voters at that time, were supportive of masks, believed that the science behind them and that they worked, and that it would help Trump's favorability ratings as it pertained to managing the coronavirus pandemic. And even in the face of that data, he refused to get behind it because his gut told him that a mask looks weak, that if you're covering your face with a piece of cloth, you look weak, and he didn't want to look weak, and he refused to do it. And he did on a couple of occasions, but mostly refused. And he had support, by the way, from the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, who backed him up. In that conversation and in other conversations, argued that it was politically better for the president not to support wearing a mask, even though the polling data, his own pollster, was showing numbers that say the opposite.
I think I'm supposed to turn it over for questions from the audience, but before I do that, just real quick, one final question for me. A Very Stable Genius came out at, I think, mid to late January 2020. And this is just another reporter to reporter question, because I'm very curious about this. You write in the introduction that you didn't think you were going to write another book together. Obviously, the book was a huge sensation and a big hit. But when did you guys start this book? When did you know you had enough? I assume that people came to you regardless and said, you did so wonderfully, would love to work with you again. When were you able to decide that, man, 2020, at what point, enough is going on right now that we have a true story to tell? And how did you make the decision?
It's true that Phil and I did not anticipate writing another book. Well, we were exhausted and we felt like we kind of, we feel like we got it, right? Regardless of the commercial success, we feel like we explained what motivates Donald Trump, and that was our goal. What's pulling the levers in this guy's head? How does his presidency really run behind the scenes? But we were updating, for the paperback, remember paperbacks? And we were updating information for that. And as we did, 2020 is starting to unspool in a really uncomfortable way. Not only are we all now burrowed in our homes in the spring and wondering whether our children are going to go back to school and wondering whether we're going to be able to go back to our offices. But then what happens? George Floyd's killed, and there is a really powerful racial reckoning in this country, and a president who, instead of being a healer, is again a divider. And the conversations with our editor then were more about how updating the paperback would be such short shrift to really what's going on here. The truth of the matter is we actually had to cover 2020 for the Washington Post. So we didn't start working on the book until January, interestingly, just before January 6th.
Wow.
And we wrote and reported the book in an exceptionally tight time frame, which...
Wait a minute, you said you started writing this book in January of this year?
Reporting and writing this book in January.
Jesus.
Yeah.
And actually,
That's unbelievable.
Not till the inauguration. We didn't start any work on this book until January 20th, 21st.
And just to stress that all 797 people watching how actually truly extraordinary that is. I mean, I'm shocked to hear that you did this in that amount of time and are here standing to talk about it. That's a great. There she goes. It's incredible.
Thank you.
All right, I know everybody else wants to ask questions, and I'm just chatting about how cool I think Carol and Phil are. So, Andrew, you want to pop back in and get some of these questions going?
Yep. But Jacob, you stay on because you have so many great questions, and they've covered a lot of material. You've all covered a lot of material, as and answered a lot of terrific questions. But I want to start by saying that we've had more audience questions for this program than any virtual program we've done so far. So thank you for that, everybody. So many people asked, what was the most shocking thing you learned while writing and researching the book? And then to add to that, were there any surprising heroes in your research?
Phil, you go first.
Well, I think the most shocking thing that we learned in doing these in-depth book interviews was just how much more dangerous and scary things were behind the scenes than we knew in real time. And the biggest example of that, I think, is how seriously General Milley and other leaders at the Pentagon took the idea that Trump would actually try to use the military in a coup to stay in power after losing the election. That's a really chilling thing to comprehend, and it's not something any of us knew about in real time. Certainly people, imagined that as a possibility, but the fact that that was a real subject of not just conversation, but of planning and fear at the very highest levels of the Pentagon was pretty shocking to learn. And your question about heroes, there are no perfect heroes in this book. There are people who acted heroically at certain times, but we would posit that nobody in this administration or who's a character that we chronicled in this book is an absolute hero or acted heroically, every day of that year. Even General Milley, who a lot of readers will conclude was a hero at the end, had some slip-ups in around the Black Lives Matter protests, and he's the first to admit that.
Carol, your turn.
I agree with Phil. I think that was the killer, to learn that it was so much more scary to folks inside. There were other small examples, At one point we learned that Mark Esper was the defense secretary, wanted to try to find a way to conceal from the president this really good news in the summer that the vaccine developments were proving promising and that it looked like they were going to have really high efficacy. And the fear that the Secretary of Defense had was that if the president learned this, he would try to force the administration of the vaccines before they were ready. So he was trying to keep that under wraps. Another shocker to me was, just the Donald Trump interview. Phil and I have talked about it so many times together. He never regretted anything. He thinks he was one of the best presidents in history. His only regret is that he did not unleash active duty troops on Black Lives Matter protesters.
How did you prepare for the Trump interview? Did you take into account any particular psychological aspects of Trump before you sat down with him?
We're not psychologists, although my mother is one. But having covered Trump for 4 years, everyone who deals with him and who has interviewed him before becomes a bit of an armchair psychologist, as you are when you're thinking about any subject that you're going to interview. But he's a particularly complicated one. And, we went in knowing this was not going to be a live television interview. It wasn't going to be broadcast in full. And so we decided we didn't want to, challenge him at every sentence. We weren't going to interrupt the interview to say, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. Because you do that, you end up talking in a circle and it ends pretty quickly. So, we went in with not much of an agenda beyond wanting to hear him explain himself and explain what happened in that year and press him where we thought it was really needed, but to mostly be listeners and hear what he had to say. And I think, frankly, hearing him say all of this stuff out loud was as damning and devastating for him as any sort of a immediate kind of fact check, rebuttal, rat-a-tat-tat style interview.
I loved your description of the people coming and going at Mar-a-Lago and what people were wearing. And Kimberly Guilfoyle, the way she approached him was really interesting, because you say that she didn't seem like she was just coming up to talk to her boyfriend's dad, but she was much more sort of reticent. That was fascinating. Do you have any insights about that? I was just out of curiosity.
I thought some of the scene there was just also riveting to watch. If I hadn't had to be a reporter there, I might have just sat in a corner and kept watching every bit of it, staying as long as I could. Laura Ingraham coming in her like clam bake Lily Pulitzer pink pants and, saying, Donald, you need to tune in tomorrow night. I'm going to really take it to the doctors in my program. She was referring to criticizing Fauci and Birx and Redfield after they had just been interviewed, describing the pretty horrendous response to the pandemic and the challenges they had working with Donald Trump. Dan Crenshaw, congressman, wanders in telling the president how healthy and hale he looks and what's your secret, sir? Again, a series of ring kissers, a series of people who want Donald Trump's endorsement for political reasons and who want his favor. Kimberly Guilfoyle, so obsequious the way she tiptoed over to try to plead with him to come visit her table and her friends. Not the way I think, I would have approached my husband's father.
Sorry to interject, but did you guys take him up on the offer to talk further? Yeah, because it sounds like he said, hey, let's do this again.
We didn't. Good reporter question, though, Jacob.
Just curious.
Based on your reporting, do you believe that the Trump loyalists and those ring kissers that you just described actually believe the election was stolen, or rather that this is all pretend and something that they just had to go along with?
I mean, certainly you might find one or two ring kissers who believe it, but most of those fake people are pretty rational actors, and they know the reality, which is that Joe Biden won the election and Trump lost the election, and they go along with the lie because it's Trump's lie, and they have to do what Trump wants, and because, frankly, so many of Trump's supporters are all caught into it and believe it, and they feel there's a political danger for themselves if they don't go along with the lie. I think it's one of the reasons why you see Kevin McCarthy going along and so many other Republicans in the House. I mean, they know the election was lost. They have been dealing with elections their whole careers. This is their business. They understand precinct data and state vote totals better than anybody. But they go along with it because of the power of Trump and because so many of millions of his supporters go along with it.
How do you think history, short-term and long-term, will characterize the Trump years and the party that indulged him?
It
I mean,
seems no.
wrote 2 books in 4 years on this one administration.
Already American historians are taking pen to paper to say that this was one of the most perilous and dangerous presidencies. It started off as just an incredibly hurly-burly, rickety roller coaster, but then it became one that threatened American lives, surely lost American lives, the way the response to the pandemic was managed, and then put the democracy at risk of going off those roller coaster rails. I've talked to, and I know Phil has too, many American historians who would rate Donald Trump in the bottom the bottom percentile of presidents because of his ignorance of governing, his lack of discipline, his lack of ability to recognize sort of the 3 branches of government and how they work. He, on the other hand, views his presidency as one of the very best. As he told us, he could beat George Washington if he came back from the dead.
And Abraham Lincoln, if they were teamed up.
Correct. Good correction.
Are you aware of any other any even bigger bombshells or revelations that are coming soon, which could deliver Trump to justice? Is there going to be any huge surprise plot twist that you know about that we don't? Anything that might be on the cutting room floor, so to speak?
If we knew about it, it would have been in this book.
I believe that.
So the answer is no, but the investigations are ongoing, and who knows what they might uncover, but it would have to be a pretty giant bombshell to deliver Trump to justice, because there've been a lot of bombshells the last 4 years, and none has delivered justice.
Jared Kushner was and could possibly still be Trump's Rasputin. What was his role in the Capitol insurrection and the post-election chaos? Do you think he encouraged any of that?
Jared Kushner had been really at his father-in-law's side for so many things, and deputizing himself as the expert to solve every problem. He decided when coronavirus got serious, he'd be in charge of coronavirus. He decided he'd be in charge of PPE and acquiring it. Then he decided he'd be in charge of accelerating the vaccines through Operation Warp Speed. But after the election, he actually became so much more MIA. He and his wife, believed that the president had lost the election. They were not fools. They had seen the polling, and they began to retreat from him and work on their own projects. Ivanka mostly on thinking about where she was next going to live and where her children were going to go to school, and Jared working on Middle East peace, and really very, very much not present.
Jacob, what was the most shocking revelation to you as a seasoned MSNBC and NBC reporter who's seen it all in the past 5 years?
I think probably the moment I think it was in the Oval Office where General Milley told Stephen Miller to shut the front door, in not such nice words. I was, it was actually pretty shocking to me to hear. I mean, I know people use salty language, but to hear the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in such a formal setting say to an advisor who's, I mean, particularly, I mean, on everything, but again, through my lens on the horror of the family separation policy, the guy who really drove the president to do probably one of the most despicable things in the history of the United States, just to look right at him and say to him, "Shut the F up." Man, what a moment in this book to read it in such a vivid scene and detail.
And I guess we can end with this question. How has Trump managed to maintain the affection and loyalty of such a large segment of the American public?
He's got them hooked, totally hooked. It started in 2016, when he was such a good campaigner in convincing a group of Americans who feel forgotten and dismissed, feel like the country is not going the way they would like it to go. It's becoming a country with a lot more people of color, and that makes a lot of this group of folks uncomfortable for some reason. He tapped into their fears and their anger, and he told them he was going to look out for them, and he cared about what they cared about, and he was their defender. But he did one thing worse. He kind of gave them their first hit of the addictive product, which is he amped up the fear and the anger. He increased their belief that things were off the rails and only he could save them. I alone can fix it is not a joke. He really convinced people that he's the savior. And to repeat something Milley told his aides and confidants, this is akin to the gospel of the Fuhrer. If you get other people to be afraid and you convince them that you're the savior, then you're unbeatable.
Phil, what about you?
Carol answered the question, so we're good.
I want to thank Phil, Carol, Jacob so much for this great program. This book I Alone Can Fix It, is truly terrific and stunning and shocking. Go to Chevalier's, go to our website, which will get you to Chevalier's.
It's a great bookstore. They're the best. Support them and order through there.
And they have book plates, lots of book plates. And if they run out of books, Carol and Phil will sign more. Jacob has been in there many times signing separated. And they have separated too. And I know he'll go and sign book plates or stock or whatever. So thanks to all of you, and see you soon. We have a huge, great fall schedule coming up, and you'll hear about that shortly. Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks,
Okay.
Phil.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank
Take
you.
care.